Okay, well, welcome everybody to webinar number 3 now of this new digital materialities series. Just a few words about the seminar. It's based in Paris, as much as these things can be based anywhere these days. But it's, I guess the silver lining of this pandemic is, of course, that we can have people, both speakers and attendees from all over the world, if they're ready to wake up at unduly hours of the night sometimes. Just a few words about some of the next speakers we'll be hosting in the seminar. We have one session a month. The next session is on the 8th of February, and we'll be listening to Sophie Pittman from Finland, who is going to be talking about a reconstruction project of a 16th century doublet. On the 15th of March, we'll be listening to Hélène Valence, who we're talking about a mechanical clock that reenacts some key passages of American history. And on the 12th of April, Amanda Herbert from the Folger Library will be talking about a project on recipes and food. So keep tuned in. Geraldine's now going to introduce Bénédicte, and for your questions, just a thing about your questions, pop them in the chat box, and then we'll ask people to activate their mics so they can ask their questions.
Thank you, Ariane, and welcome to all of you. It is a pleasure to co-host this webinar and to welcome today Dr. Miyamoto, who is an associate professor at the Université Sorbonne Nouvelle, Paris 3, at the Institut du Monde Anglophone. She researches the British art world of the 18th century and its professional practices. More on the use of manuals in workshops can be found in her chapter, The Influence of Drawing Manuals on the British Practice and Reception of Fancy Pictures, which has been published in 2020 in a book entitled Fancy in 18th Century European Visual Culture at the Press of Oxford University Studies in the Enlightenment. Bénédicte Miyamoto, the floor is yours. Thank you.
All right. All right, I trust you can all see the PowerPoint.
Yes, all set.
Okay. Well, I'm delighted to be here tonight, and I thank Géraldine Chouard and Ariane Fento for hosting me to their exciting new webinar series, Digital Materialities. I would also like to slip in some thanks to Caroline de Rossel-Mélich at the Folger and Stephanie Stillo at the Library of Congress, especially because academics would get nowhere without rare book curators and catalogers to help them. Okay, so tonight's talk is about how did the manual professions read professional manuals. It's impossible to read the spines of the books in this illustration of an artist's workshop. They're stored in early modern fashion with the 4 edges facing outwards. So were they actually manuals? I'd like to think so. And the manuals I surveyed for this research I'm presenting tonight at the Folger Shakespeare Library, the Dibner Library of the History of Science and Technology, and the Rosenwald Collection of the Library of Congress seem to bear this out. They're often covered in paint stains, ink spills, compass point, pinholes, and a lot of grubby fingerprints. And if they were manuals, did their directions written on paper actually translate to the reality of the workshop? That's a more difficult question. Many of these manuals were produced by compilers, printers, publishers who did not actually have a practical experience of the art advertised in those books. Hence the errors littering both texts and figures, especially in the pristine copy's extent. And that's why I'd like to advocate for a use of soiled copies rather than pristine copies. So we know they were not written by professionals, but how were they read by those professionals? It's important if we want to answer Pamela Smith's questions about craft and technical manuals and the material world of artisans to ask ourselves, was reading actually a learning process? How can one define professionally specific reading? So the artisans I'm especially interested in my survey are the artisanally trained individuals who followed somewhat fluid careers and who were not locked into a traditional craft, meaning painters, but also draftsmen, surveyors, engineers, and engravers. These artisans were both skilled and skirting on the margins of learned knowledge, thirsting for exchange with learned scholars. So they're precisely those artisans Pamela Long focuses on when she writes about the trading zones between the learned and the artisans. For example, these were the artisans who felt the need to add to the theoretical tome of Vincent Scamozzi's Idea della Architettura Universale, which you have on the screen here. They felt the need to add a technical appendix called Description and Use of an Ordinary Joint Rule Fitted for Line for the ready drawing of the architrave, the frieze, and the cornice in any order by the artisan John Brown. So hypothetically, once you had tried out and stained and worn out the paper version of the joint rule made to fit the book, the advertisement at the end of the book encouraged you to buy the real version, the wood and steel version, at John Brown's mathematical instrument shop, the Sundial. However, it's a fallacy to think that this is devised for reading as actual learning, a learning that would happen from cover to cover in the slow mastery of the real life workshop instrument. The ground rule book is actually designed as a reference book, and the paper instrument is nothing but an advertisement. And that's very close to what's happening in the drawing manuals I'm talking about tonight. In the 17th and 18th century, drawing lessons were to be found in art of paintings, they were abridged in copybooks, but they were also repackaged and specialized, for example, in manuals of architecture, perspective, surveillance, in military instruction books, as well as in books of secrets. There were also recipes for color. They had an even greater diffusion, appearing not only in arts of paintings and heraldry tomes, but in husbandry manuals, almanacs, and herbals, since color making was essential to many craftsmen and also had household uses. For example, in this heavily stained herbal and copybook by Crispin van der Pas called The Garden of Flowers, the color indication in the text are explicitly about the pigments to be used to reproduce their natural colors and not about the botanical colors in real life. So what can be achieved by looking specifically at those soiled drawing manuals? What can be achieved by a survey of those stains and dirt? These books are covered in traces of use, and I think their abundance makes it possible to start investigating a mass of nameless readers. And to do so, the point is to recover their habitual gestures, their community practices. To the question of where the reading took place, which is one of the initial questions of the archaeology of reading, my compilation points to the workshop. These drawing manuals also testify to an accomplished use by a tight-knit community of practitioners, and practitioners that were not only well read, but who read quite well. For example, this means that the books, often showing traces of the reader having read the other books in this drawing manual corpus. For example, here you can see a sanguine cherub head on the front leaf end of Barry's Painter's Voyage to Italy on the right, which is directly inspired from the techniques you can find in Gori's Introduction to the General Art of Drawing. So just like reading studies have unsettled the idea that books were read from front to back, even for highbrow texts, the artisanal reading studies have unsettled the idea that knowledge circulates with incremental pushes, for example, with an accumulation of knowledge and at a specific edition level. When we look at those manuals, we see that information spread in haphazard ways in the modern period, and a lot of the reading happened through cross-referencing and the repetition of recipes and methods from one book to another. For example, the edition here you can see on the screen by the reader of a gold-sized recipe for globes in William Salmon's Polygraphice. The survey I'm carrying out records all these annotations, the drawings in the margins, and the coloring ins. Basically, all the marks of reading that happen to the books once they're out of the printing press and of the bookseller shop. Those how-to books have been often dismissed as amateur, and they've been damned for their condensed lesson plans. And in a way, this belittles the readers into mere learners. It tends to ignore the interactive relationship between the manual's pages and its reader. And in fact, anyone working in children literature or educational literature will recognize these obstacles. It's been an easy criticism of drawing manuals because very often the most noticeable traces of use are also noticeably unproficient, as you can see in the next slide. Here, for example, you have a very unskillfully drawn figures attempting a perspective effect of foreground placement and second ground placement in a plate of Bernard Picard, a new drawing book of modes. You also have, for example, this nightmarish contoured child figure made from the verso of a plate because you can follow the indentation of the engraving from a plate of John Bates, The Mystery of Nature and Art, and it results in a comically bad drawing. And these are not only comical, but they're also very memorable because the visual marks that jar are also the most noticeable. What my survey indicates is that, in fact, these grotesque markings are largely exceeded in quantity by more proficient marks of reading. Things like ink and lead corrections to plates, the rectifying of measures in the figures, the adding of labels, the adding of cross-references, the tracing without damaging the page. All of the marks that actually improve the manual seamlessly and can go unnoticed. As underlined before, many of these manuals were produced by professionals of the book trade, professionals of the abridgment especially, who did not have a practical experience of the art of painting or drawing, and hence the errors in the book. But most of the written marginalia in the manuals point out these faults, compensate for elided knowledge, or cross-reference to other manuals. So tonight, I will look specifically at two marks, the pin marks and the stains, which are basically the more professionally specific marks to be found in drawing manuals. And I'm going to tease out the reader's meanings in doing those. We're going to reconstruct some of the practices and also assess their level of expertise. The first mark we're going to look at are stains. For example, a lot of them come like the one we have here on the board. It's a 1654 edition of John Bates' The Mysteries of Nature and Art. And at the bottom of the page, there's a swatch of red brushstroked under the recipe for a cheaper alternative to cinnabar, vermilion, and lake red colors. So the reader here is validating knowledge that the author himself admits in the text he has never tried. Those color samples are frequent in the books that I've been surveying, And they can stand as the equivalent to a probatum est in an early modern recipe book, for example. They're very often located in the periphery of the color lists and the color recipes. And they're actually further proof that of the centrality of those lists of ingredients and of recipes. They're the importance to the book's appeal. But of course, those are intentional stains. The archaeology of reading I'm conducting gets a little bit messy, literally and figuratively, when we're dealing with accidental marks. The manuals are actually littered with spills, stains, and inadvertent brushstrokes. They make up close to 60% of all the recorded marks in the 10,000 pages that I've entered in my data collection. Evidently, this quantity of data shows that these manuals were kept at hand, that they were open to be referred to as the reader moved to larger surfaces of experimentation, such as loose paper or a propped up canvas. This means that these books were physically in the periphery of the painting practice, and that these books, often of a small format, were probably held in one hand with the brush in another. So they were basically, I quote, at the center of the reader's field of vision and attention, which Grafton and Jardine investigate in their foundational text on reading practices, how Gabriel Livy read his Livy. So all those strokes, those splatters, those smudges, evidence different tools being used also. Things like quills, pencils, brushes are recognizable in the strokes that are left, as well as a variety of mediums. And all this testifies to an extensive engagement with the text. On record, we have, for example, split the two categories of wet medium and dry medium. So for example, in wet medium, we find, of course, ink, but also oil paint of different colors, washes of different colors in a much larger quantity, because those are more accessible and economical. But also you find traces of binder, gloss, and also of gold paint flake. When you look at the dry mediums, which are the second part of my category of accidental stains, I have categorized things like, for example, charcoal, sanguine, pastel, chalk, and crayons. These accidental marks of reading allow us to conceive of a whole world of practice that the intentional doodles and the rough sketches in the margins only hint at, because identifying them also means reconstructing all the different uses of these mediums. For example, if you investigate dry medium on the slide here, you can see in the third vignette blue chalk deposited, which has highlighted the paper's watermark. And this comes either from the action of rubbing an engraving to offset the inserted indentation, or the insertion of a drawing in chalk between the pages that has rubbed off. For example, it can also help to recover practices and to put reading back in context. If we look at the wet medium, this splatter of grey wash it's accidental, but it's not incidental. It's located in Serlio's first book of architecture, and we can correlate this with the fact that grey wash was traditionally used for architectural drafts. So here we can see a professional use of the medium. Those traces of wet medium, such as wash, paint, ink, as well as glossy splashes of binder, flecks of gold, they tend to have resisted time because first, because they're physically trapping the pigments in a much more durable way, and also because the bookseller's zealous cleaning has made them because they have resisted the bookseller's zealous cleaning, which especially in the 1940s and 50s would wash and bleach the pages of books to be sold. Whereas dry medium, of course, have been much more erasable. Things like sanguines, crayons, lead, charcoal, and pastel have often disappeared, and you need to look very closely at the material, something that is impossible in the digital formats. And you need to also sometimes reconstruct when you see that a page has been sized or has been intensively washed. You can think that there were indeed marks in those drawing manuals. This is a problem, for example, that I encountered when I looked at the Rosenwald collection at the Library of Congress. Rosenwald was a color specialist, but he was looking for colors that were intentional, not accidental, and his copies have been sort of made pristine by booksellers who served his collecting habits. So the sheer diversity of the mediums recorded should be contrasted with the difficulties associated also in the early modern period with the production, the handling, the sourcing, and the preserving of artistic materials, tools, and especially pigments. These marks evidence, for example, the reader's skills in using pigment. The fact that you have colors in those books tell you that they were able to not only grind them, wash them, boil them, mix them with gum water, mix them with Arabic gum. They were basically the whole scope of pigment making at the time. So clearly the term amateur or learner, especially for the 17th century and early 18th century, should be used with care when we're discussing these soiled drawing manuals. These manuals testify to an extensive engagement with the text, also an economic involvement with the procuring of these ingredients and the making of these ingredients. The second thing we're going to be looking at today are the use of pins. And this had to do with the practice of transfers that were to be found in those copy manuals and those drawing manuals. Artist manuals gave extensive instructions on how to copy, to scale to size, and to transfer designs. Research in the last decade has emphasized the importance of these drawing manuals for the design industry and the centrality of pattern books in the arts. One of the transfer technique was well known is the gridding technique. Here again, we have this little child Pluto figure from John Bates' Mystery of Nature and Art, which is inspired from the foundational Karachi's pattern book that you have on the left. You can see that the plate is only semi-gridded for transfer, which does not correspond to the practice that is spelled out in the text. If you go to the text, Bates actually explains, and I quote, "I thought fitting to give you a word or two, wherefore I have not made the cross-pricked lines to pass through the figures. The reason is, 1, because the figures would have been thereby somewhat defaced, 2, because some choose rather to draw without such rules, 3, for others with a ruler and black lead plummet, they may cross the figures through and with white breadcrumbs take out the same again at pleasure." So the manual's author did anticipate an interactive, an alternative reading and use with very different levels of expertise. So how were pins used in these methods of copying? As you probably know, the copybooks and the drawing manuals were designed very often with templates or banks of images and figures to be copied and to be reassembled. Here you can even see how a reader has selected and reconstructed with a lead pen a face from a mouth and nose on the right-hand side. One of the transfer technique that was recommended to trace and transfer was to do it by the indentation with the blunt head of a pin on a paper underneath. So these traces of practice are the most difficult to spot, given that printing itself, or especially engraving an intaglio, can result in such sinking area on the surface of the page. But one way to look at it and to spot it on those rare books is when the tracer diverges from the engraving, or when, for example, they only select one figure in a whole engraving. Here you first have on the left-hand side the verso of the engraving that you have on the right-hand side. And you can see that this only one of the figures has been selected. On the recto version, you can see also this in the fact that, in the fact that the heel has been recreated. The heel that was hidden behind another figure has been recreated so that it could be selected and taken out for transfer. So this is a technique that was done by tracing, and it was very, it's not only difficult to spot, but it also is a technique that didn't damage the page. Some of the more damaging uses of pin is when it was pricked for transfer, which is called pin pricking for transfer. It was widely used in the early modern and modern period, and art historians are especially aware of the first method. The first method was to use the model as a stencil designed. This comes from, especially from the use of transfer for frescoes. What you did is you would damage the surface of the original design by pin pricking, but preserve the surface on which the design is transferred, since once you've pin pricked the stencil design, you pounce it, making sort of charcoal dust go through the pinholes, mark the transfer underneath, but those pounced dots can be erased, which means that the resulting design is pristine. The reason why I'm showing this sheet on the board is that it has been pricked for transfer, which is not immediately noticeable. The reason why so many flower pattern books are rare is actually because they were used to prick and pounce, especially over fabric for embroidery. The pricks here are barely noticeable on the surface of the engraving on the recto, but they're very visible on the verso, as you can see here. The evidence of this prick and pounce has been expertly cleaned up, probably at the moment of sale of this folio, but you can see that it's still visible in this charcoal halo around the right-hand side design, which is also something you can look at to see if those drawing manuals have been used and have been practiced upon. The second method is to actually pinprick all the way through. And this is really a method that was used for drawing copies and for practice. So you would have two papers, the first one being the design you want to transfer, and the second paper underneath being the place where you want the design to go through. And you pinprick through both of the sheets, and the dots that you join in the second sheet, your resulting drawing, are actually the pinholes created in both sheets. So the pinholes on the resulting paper are joined for design. You can see it here on a plate of the 1668 Excellency of the Pen and Pencil, which is comically ruined by the reader having a go at pinpricking the design present on the reverse plate, page 44. So the male figure and its outstretched hand appear amongst the portrait as if picking the nose on the other side. This technique was favored because it was much less invasive than the one that used pouncing, because it barely damaged the initial design. As you can see here, page 44 is barely noticeably damaged. So this was a technique that could be used. Of course, this is an extreme example of pinpointing, but it was widely used, for example, for maps to transfer with a perfect scale. This example on the slide, for example, is a master map Vauban's Traité des Sièges, which was commonly used in military schools to teach surveyor and military engineers to draw. And this sheet, as you can see, looks perfectly pristine, but it has been pinpricked by compass use, but also to transfer the design to scale. As you can see, actually it's barely noticeable on my photo here, but you can see that this has been pinpricked for, there you go. This has been pinpricked to transfer the design. So it was useful for design, for practice, and when the original was not to be damaged by pounce. So when the original was kept as a master copy, which is often the case in drawing schools or anything to teach drawings. As you can see, these visual marks of pinpricking are barely noticeable on the originals, and they often require passing something that's called an Illuminator panel under the sheet to notice it. You have at the center here of the slide a Hamlet actor print, which at the background is photographed with an Illuminator panel behind, and which makes the dots noticeable. So to conclude, so much information can be teased out of visual marks in book. They might not help us to uncover the identity of the reader, but they can give evidence about the physical setting, the available materials, and the activities that were concomitant to reading. So these visual marks have much to tell us about how early modern and modern readers read, which should always be approached as a measure of how they learnt and how they mastered. For all marginalia, in fact, show the close reading and the active learning process of past users. So that's the first conclusion. Practicing while reading was evidently common, but our perception of how proficient the reader was and how effective the manuals were should not be based solely on the outcomes of those visual marks in the margin, which are often a first draft or a first reading. Or at least it shouldn't be dependent on only the ones that are immediately noticeable and decipherable. As studies of experiential learning have demonstrated, though learning is not always evidence in performance, it does occur through the course of connected experiences. And the margins of manuals are full of these connections between text and practice. The fact that the drawing manual plates displayed only bits and pieces of an ideal final composition also stemmed from this pedagogical pledge. Learning is the process of constructing rather than transmitting knowledge. Basically, it happens piecemeal, and it's a construction of knowledge, especially through cross-referencing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bénédicte, for this really interesting paper. So if you have questions for Bénédicte, which I'm sure there will be, do either raise your hand or pop your question in the chat box, and we can kind of ask people to turn their mics on. And I had a question as people get their thoughts together. I had a question about the analysis. Obviously, the pin marks, you told us about this special light enabled you to see it when it wasn't very visible. About the other marks, the stains, have you been able to do any pigment analysis to know whether the person had actually done the recipe that's in the book, or whether it's just read but maybe it hasn't quite followed the recipe? Have you done any of this, or is this visual identification?
Well, it all started first, and that's why I thank the curators and the paper specialists of the two institutions where I was. It first started with identification with their help. But I was lined up with a selection of 10 books for two things. First, pigment analysis, but also reflects light, just to identify specifically the binder gloss, which I found they're completely untranslatable on a slide because you cannot see them on a PowerPoint. So I didn't show many of those, so I was lined up for analysis of those at the Library of Congress Conservation Lab. The problem is this was supposed to start happening on the 30th of March, 2020, and the Library of Congress has closed since the 17th of March. So this will happen afterwards, but I'm happy to say that the first conclusions were validated by Stephanie Stillo at the Library of Congress. At least they helped me to start this analysis.
Thank you very much. Do you have any questions for Bénédicte?
Well, I have one. Oh, okay. No, you go first.
So put your mic on, Lynn.
Lynn?
Very good idea. Are you sure, Geraldine? I can wait, really.
Go ahead, Lynn.
Okay, it's just, Bénédicte, thank you so very much. It's I was very interested by your reconstruction of some of the ways in which these stains, for instance, got onto the books themselves and where they were located in relation to, the artist's workshop and other materials. And I'm just wondering if you have any visual evidence in paintings of this reconstruction of yours. For instance, somebody, maybe a painter, holding a book in one hand and a brush in the other.
The problem with the kind of portrait painting of artists at the period is that they're always extremely performative. They're set up in ways that cannot entirely be taken for granted. You all know about this Joshua Reynolds portrait of himself with Michelangelo sort of bowing to him in statue form, etc. There's always something very performative about those artist portraits. But I've been especially interested, because I'm tracking those stains, in the amount of stains that you see in scribe pictures when there isn't this idea of, pretending you're an artist. For example, the pictures of Saint Jerome writing, where you can see stains on the side of his scriptorium, on the side of his inkwell, and sort of splattering his text. So yes, the fact that writing, reading was messy, and that both were happening on the same tables is quite well documented in the archaeology of reading studies. I mean, I was very interested today in hearing another presentation about conservation, which said that conservation is not keeping records, but managing the loss of the past. And there's a lot of that to do with the reconstruction that I'm trying to do today. There's so much that we've lost about the practice of drawing manuals, and we have to reconstruct it from some kind of forensic evidence, or like blood splatters or paint splatters that we see around the books.
I was just wondering if you had some visual evidence to back it up a little bit more, because these kinds of reconstructions are always, well, they're dangerous at some points. If you assume things that maybe you need to, it's helpful to have other evidence as well to back up these reconstructions. But I really appreciate your making them and making this attempt. It's excellent.
Okay,
thanks.
I think Ladan had a question.
Well, I didn't want to go before Geraldine, if Geraldine has been waiting to ask her question. There's no emergency on my side. Do you want to go ahead first?
No, go ahead, Ladan.
Okay, thank you very much. Fascinating material, Bénédicte. I really enjoyed your paper. from beginning to end, it's wow, it opens fascinating avenues. I was very much interested by something that you said in passing about herbals and garden manuals that could be used for floral designs, for example, for textiles or things like that. And I was wondering about the price of these, if we have an idea of the original price range of these books, which could perhaps allow for books to be used in a way against the grain. I mean, a garden manual not used by a gardener, for example, but the possibility for an artisan who would be engaged in say, floral designs for textiles to be able to afford to buy this book on the side and reuse it. Do we have an idea of the price range of these manuals?
So the copybooks of part of my corpus are on the cheaper side of the books, whereas some of the drawing manuals can actually verge towards, and you can see this in the enlarging formats of them, for example, they sometimes converge toward the presentation copy. So some of them are actually quite expensive, and that also emphasizes why it was so important not to damage the master copies or the engraving that were inside. But in those drawing manuals, you really have the whole scope. You have very cheap manuals where there's only one fold out plate, where all the figures are crammed into just one fold out plates. And those, you know, first would have been too small to actually copy figures from in a big enough design, but also would have been quite cheap. I think for the pattern books, I know that there were a lot of lace and embroidery pattern books. Not many of them are extant, but those were also on the cheaper side. But the ones that that I've shown on screen, the Crispin van der Pas, is really it's a herbal, but at the same time it really is designed for painters and for reproduction, for representation, because you can see that the text is not making a botanical assessment of the plants, but is telling you how to represent it. None of the color names, for example, there aren't color names, there are pigment names. So it's really oriented towards the painter. I don't know if I've answered your full question.
Excellent, thank you very much.
I think there was a question from Brigitte and then Frédéric.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Bénédicte. Fascinating and as ever, stimulating and thought-provoking. I thought about, as an illustration scholar, I immediately thought about this kind of blurred notion of illustration in your case, because I was wondering if I mean, say these are illustration of plants or illustration of architectural designs, etc. What happens to the very idea of illustration? Is it the illustration that accompanies the actual text, which is sort of the thing you have when you know how to use, I mean, the handbook aspect of the drawing manual. But I was tempted, and I was wondering what you think about it. I was really tempted of thinking of those images with the stains and with the pinpricks as some kind of secondary narrative to which, I mean, almost fictional narrative to which those, not only the images, but the stains and the pinpricks could be associated. In other words, illustration of just more than the text you can read.
Yes, and this happens especially for the English versions of those drawing manuals, the ones that are in the terms of the 17th century and 18th century, the ones that are Englished, because very often the theoretical text becomes a little leaner and becomes much more obsessed with the actual practice and you know, best practices for best outcomes, strategies, etc. And what you see very often, let's say for, you know, a typical drawing manual, although that's a little bit difficult to say because the corpus is so fluid and bizarre. You would have a text and an illustration, but this is not going to be surprising to you. That starts by following each other quite well. Lesson 1, figure A, lesson 2, figure B, etc. And then that starts to diverge. Because at the end of it, you're also dealing with something that needs to be sold and advertised as having a lot of images. You know, the more copper plates, the bigger the price, or the more advertising. And so you end up, for example, the one I put on screen, which is the Ars Pictoria by Alexander Brown, which is part of the more sort of the more expensive copies, the more quality copies. You end up with lots of figures that are put in the end, which have nothing to do with the text. They're not related to the text. They're meant to be part of the lessons that you follow up. They're providing you with more of what you've already been provided with. But at the same time, it also ends with an advertisement at the end saying more of those plates can be found at Tucker's shop, for it says at the end. And you learn that Tucker is the bookseller selling Alexander Brown's book, and Alexander Brown is living above Tucker's shop, etc., etc. So it's a whole advertising machine at the same time. It's not just lesson plans neatly correlated with the illustrations.
Well, I'm going to think about the notion of invisible illustration now. We keep in touch. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
I think Frédéric Auger has a question as well. Frédéric?
Yes, thank you very much. I'll just turn the microphone on because I have a poor connection. Thank you very much, Bénédicte, for a very entertaining lecture. My question had to do with the kind of stains or the typology of stains that you're looking at. Mostly what you talked about were what we could call professional stains, but we've all experienced spilling coffee on students' work, or I remember in the film Amadeus, Mozart spilling wine on his scores. And I was wondering if you were also interested in those even more accidental stains like coffee stains or punch or wine or sneezing or worse.
I've actually really tried to limit myself to the stains that I could actually identify, which are the easy ones, the one with the brushstroke, the one where you can see that the drying pattern has put more color on the side, meaning that this was a wash with the pigment that sort of grows out, etc. Those that really look like paint or wash. But clearly, you can also talk about the use of those manuals and how heavily used they were, because they're also soiled. And here I'm not talking about paint and wash. They're often, they are books where the first leaves and the end leaves are very damaged. That's also typical of sort of pamphlet size little booklets. And you have watermarks. I haven't been able to identify coffee marks or wine marks, but I'm sure that the conservation could find this. I know that there are some researchers looking at the moment at medieval illumination texts, specifically for those things, all the damage that happens to the book outside of what should be in the book. But I haven't looked at that.
Thank you. I'll jump in if I may, because I think this ties in well with something we discussed in the first session when Marine, I don't know whether she's still part of the participants, Marine Bellego, we talked about the kind of thin margin between loss and evidence, and how damage is its own kind of evidence. You know, like the damaged books, the kind of stains, the dirt, the grime, and how obviously this is a conservation nightmare to some extent. which we see with the pinpricks for needlework, because the main reason why needlework patterns don't survive is that they have been used, and that means they've been used up because of the pinpricks. So I think there's a really fascinating question here about loss and evidence going hand in hand in a way, and where does loss or damage have to stop for it to keep the evidence that the rich evidence that it has. And if it goes too far, obviously it's just damaged and lost completely. So I really connect to what you were saying about sort of the loss of the
managing the loss.
Yeah, managing the loss, and interpreting the loss, and sort of seeing, well, loss gets too much because then it's completely lost. But if it's pristine, then it's the evidence has been lost.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's fascinating.
Do we have any more questions? We have a couple more minutes.
Yes, I might have a question, a last question. How do you identify the different layers of reading? How can you identify the number of readers, for example, the different steps?
One of the easy answer to that is the fact that I'm trying to concentrate only on 17th and 18th century uses. And so I look into the signatures at the front of the book, and very often in those manuals, those are manuals that have been passed on. So you see a long list of owners with the dates very often. So that's one way of being able to, identify. You can also easily identify 17th and 18th century ink. So you know, with the annotation, you can also recognize, do a bit of paleography and recognize who's been writing, and especially in those books where you have a do-si-do and one hand starts on one side, another hand starts on the other side, it's easy to decipher. For the stains, it's a little bit harder, although I suspect that actually using it for practice, those books would not have been useful in 19th century. So that they're a stop to their use by the middle of the 19th century, because they're basically lists of how to make the pigments, how to make the grounds, which are techniques that are abandoned in the 19th century or not useful anymore, because you can find all the paints ready-made at the color shop. So those books have a sort of a duration of life, and therefore I think a duration of practice. The color lists, for example, by the 19th century become more complicated with Prussian blue, for example, etc. So it's sort of relatively easy to see when the interaction with the book. Well, it's not easy, but it's possible to see when the interaction with the book happened. Especially, well, I mean, it's easier with the annotation. Of course, visual marks, it's always some kind of reconstruction, because you don't actually, those are non-verbal marks. But.
Good, thank you.
Thank you very much. If there aren't any more questions, maybe you can join me in thanking once again Bénédicte for a splendid talk.